Let's study Variational Autoencoder, VAE. We have studied autoencoder already. So this is one of our earlier slides for autoencoder. And it has an encoder which takes the input and to learn a low-dimensional representation, the code or the bottleneck. And then this code will go into a decoder which attempt to reconstruct the input. And the loss function is trying to minimize the squared differences between the reconstructed image and the input image, for example. Therefore, in this autoencoder, the decoder is trying to reproduce the input from that learned representation from the encoder. A variational autoencoder looks like an regular autoencoder in terms of the encoding and decoding structure. It also has an encoder which takes data input and encodes it into a latent representation, and then this latent representation will pass through a decoder and have a reconstruction of the input. However, the difference is that in variational autoencoder, we make both the encoder and decoder to be probabilistic. For the encoder, we will draw latent variables z from a probability distribution. Right? So the code, the latent variables are sampled from a distribution rather than directly encoded. And this distribution will be conditioned on the input. So we will draw the latent variable from a conditional distribution conditioned on the input x. For the decoder, it will reconstruct x also probabilistically, and this time conditioned on the latent representation z. So this is the distribution. So it will reconstruct x by sampling from this distribution. So let's look at the encoder in more detail. So the encoder will take the input and so for example, this is a digit image as input. So the encoder will take this input and it will pass through a neural network to output, to generate parameters for a probability distribution. For example, if we use Gaussian distribution, then we just need to generate the mean and the standard deviation or the variance. So if we make a simplifying assumption, the covariance matrix is diagonal, then we just need to generate the standard deviation for each dimension. So that is the model. The encoder will try to take the input and output the parameters for the distribution or the sufficient statistics. And then this will be implemented using a neural network. And that neural network has parameter phi. So that is basically use a neural network to generate the sufficient statistics from the input. And then this encoder will sample from this distribution specified by these output parameters to get random values of the latent representation Z. Right? So this will specify a distribution, and then we sample from this distribution to get Z. So that is our code. And then let's move on to the decoder. So the decoder will take the latent variable Z, and then it will output parameters for a distribution P theta X conditioned on Z. And for example, if we also use Gaussian distribution, this will be the mean and standard deviation for each pixel in the input, in the output, in the example of the image. And this can also be implemented using a neural network. And suppose the parameter is theta. Right? So this neural network will generate the parameter for a distribution. And then the next step, we can sample that distribution to get a reconstruction of the input. So that is a decoder. And how about the loss function? So this is also a big difference from regular autoencoder. So here, the objective is to learn the parameters for the two probability distributions, which is theta, theta and phi. And for a single data point, the loss function look like this. The first term over here is the expected negative, there's a negative sign here, negative log likelihood, right? So this is a log and this is a likelihood, right? So this is log likelihood and this is negative log likelihood, right? So this is a negative log likelihood. So it's basically trying to minimize the reconstruction loss, right? So likelihood is related to the reconstruction. The second term over here, right? The second term over here is something very special. It is kind of regularization. And this is called Kullback-Leibler divergence, or simply KL divergence. This is a divergence between the encoder's distribution Q phi of Z given X, that is the encoder's distribution, and the marginal distribution Pz, right? So that is the encoder's distribution, which encodes given X encodes Z, and the marginal distribution of Z. This KL divergence measures the mismatch between these two distributions. And it basically penalizes the mismatch. Right? So here, this Q phi of Z given X is actually an approximation to the true posterior probability of Z given X. And this approximation is a technique in variational inference. And therefore, this autoencoder is called variational autoencoder because we use the technique of variational inference. But there's still another challenge, it is the expectation in this expectation in the loss function need to be approximated by choosing samples and then do the averaging. But this is not differentiable with respect to phi and theta. So that is a challenge because we cannot use stochastic gradient and autograd on the learning problem to optimize the parameter. Therefore, a reparameterization trick has been proposed. So this is a clever trick so that we can have differentiable parameters over there. So let's suppose Z is a Gaussian distribution with the mean generated by X and also the variance generated by X. We can actually sample Z using this formula, Z equal to mu X times this is standard deviation and then times epsilon. So this epsilon is sampled from a standard normal distribution with mean 0 and variance 1. And what we do is we draw samples from this normal distribution with mean 0 and standard deviation 1, unit standard deviation or unit variance. And this is not dependent on the parameters phi and theta. Right? So then this sampling process will no longer prevent us to differentiate the variables against the loss. So we can do back propagation properly. So that is a very smart reparameterization trick. So finally, let's take a look at how variational autoencoder can generate new images. So after training the model, then we can sample n z from a unit variance and zero mean normal distribution. So that is the same standard normal distribution with mean 0 and unit variance. And we sample from this distribution. And to have a z, and then decode it to get a sample. So this sample will be a sample for the entire data distribution Px. So this process basically can generate new samples that look like the input, but they are not in the input. So this is a generative model. So that is a brief introduction to variational autoencoder. In the next section, we will look at some technical details of VAE.